We left off last week as we were talking about Jesus and the disciples, and they were walking along and they were plucking heads of grain and they were eating them, and the Pharisees and the scribes said, "Why is it that your disciples do what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath?" And you remember a number of weeks ago we looked at the Old Testament scriptures surrounding the Sabbath. And who can just very briefly summarize what the Old Testament says about the Sabbath?
Keep it holy.
Keep it holy.
Don't work.
Don't work. And that's pretty much about it, ain't it? That's right. There's not a lot of very detailed explanations. There's not a lot of hoopla about it. It's basically keep the Sabbath day holy. It is holy unto the Lord. It's a day where we're not supposed to work. It's a day where there was a couple specific things. He said, don't light a fire in your house. We read a couple instances of violators of the Sabbath. One man was picking up sticks and he got put to death for it. And we saw that the punishment for violation of the Sabbath is death. So imagine that, you're not allowed to work. And if you do work, you're going to die, all right? You must take a day of rest. This is the idea of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is intended to be a blessing for man. It was a day of rest. But as we know, over the course of hundreds of years, what had the religious leaders done concerning the Sabbath?
They made a lot of strange rules.
Yeah.
What's the traditions of men?
They created a bunch of strange rules, turned into the traditions of men, and what was intended to be a blessing by the time Jesus comes on the scene, it really had become a burden. You remember some of the things we talked about. You cannot tie a knot. You cannot light a candle. You cannot put a candle out. You cannot write more than 2 letters. However, if the knot that you're tying, you can tie it with one hand or untie it with one hand, that doesn't count. And if you write one letter over here and another letter over here, then that doesn't count. And you can only take 2,000 steps, unless, of course, you planted some food 1,900 steps away, and then you can take another 2,000 steps from there. And so they just had this whole system of regulations concerning the Sabbath. And this was the oral tradition. This was the tradition of men. But it was something that the Pharisees and the scribes took very, very seriously. And so when they charged Jesus and his disciples of violating the Sabbath, of doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath, was Jesus and the disciples, were they violating the Sabbath according to God's commands? Or were they violating the oral tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees? It was the oral tradition they were violating. And we talked last week about Jesus' response. We saw some of Jesus' response when they made this accusation. And what did Jesus say?
One place he said he was the Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
The Sabbath was made for man, not for man.
That's one thing he said. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that goes back to this idea. Sabbath was intended to be a blessing. The Sabbath was for the blessing of man. Man was not made to serve the Sabbath the way that the Pharisees and the scribes had made it with all of their traditions and customs. No, man was not supposed to serve the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man as a blessing and as a day of rest. What is one of the examples that Jesus gave in defense of his position?
He talked about David going to the temple and eating the bread and giving it to his men.
Yes, very good. And we looked at that story. This was a story where David, he was being pursued by Saul. He had just left. He gets to the tabernacle. He meets the priest. He says, "Look, we're hungry." And the priest says, "I don't have any food. All I have is this holy bread." And David said, "That's all right. Let me get that holy bread." And so the priest said, "Okay, well, you can have it as long as your men are clean." And he said, "We're clean." So he pulled out the holy bread. It was apparently a Sabbath day because they pulled out the bread that was in there. They put the new bread in, and the priest gave David the bread. Now, why did Jesus use that as an example? What was it about that act of them eating that bread?
Because that's what he wants everybody to do, is to help others in need.
Yeah, so very good. Jesus was teaching them a principle. Because what they did in eating the bread was actually against God's law. They weren't supposed to eat that bread. That bread was meant only for the priests. But the priests, seeing the human need of David and his men, instead of allowing David and his men to suffer hunger in order to uphold this ceremony, He understood that doing good and loving your neighbor as yourself, feeding your neighbor when he is hungry, is an actual higher law. It's more important than the ceremony of only the priest eating the certain bread. And I think that's the example Jesus was trying to tell them. He's saying, you would rather me and my people go hungry than to be merciful. You would rather me and my people go hungry rather than let us eat, just because us eating is violating not even God's law, but your traditions. Well, don't you know David broke God's law in the same exact context, but that was more important. If David can do this, if David and his men can eat what is only meant for the priest, why can't we just eat some grain on the side of the road? We're not even breaking God's law. He gave another example. What was the other example he gave concerning the Sabbath?
He told them that one of their sheep went into a ditch, which one of them would not go.
Okay, yeah, and we'll look at that particularly tonight, because we actually didn't make it that far last time we talked. It was in Matthew chapter 12, and we're going to look at that example again in a little bit. But in Matthew chapter 12, he also said, don't you understand the priests violate the Sabbath every day, yet they're blameless. And what was it that the priests did on the Sabbath? Do you remember? We only talked about this briefly last week.
They work more.
They work, and they work more. Yeah. Every day they were required to offer one sacrifice in the morning and one sacrifice at night. But on the Sabbath, they were required to do two. Double in the morning, double. The priests work every Sabbath. They do twice as much work, but they remain blameless. And Jesus, he goes on and he tells them that there is one here who is greater than the temple. There is one here who is greater than the temple. So let's actually, I know I told you Mark 3, but let's look at Matthew chapter 12. Because we're going to continue on with Jesus' response. There was a few other things he said concerning this. He actually, it's kind of a 6-part response, Jesus' response. And so we've seen a couple of those. First of all, he said that the Sabbath was not, or man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for man. He said that there is one greater than the temple here. He said the priests remain blameless. He gave the story of David and the bread. Let's go ahead and read, beginning in... Let's begin in verse 6 of chapter 12 of Matthew. Matthew chapter 12. Let's begin in verse 6 and read verses 6 through 9.
I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue.
Okay, that's good right there. This is the next couple of parts of Jesus' response. We covered the first part of his response. Let's look at the rest of his response. When he says in verse 6, I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. What does that mean? What is he saying? One greater than the temple.
Just more than a building.
Okay, Jesus is greater than temple because it's more than a building. Elaborate on that.
I'm giving you my deer in the headlight look. I just know that's.
Okay, so more than a building. Now let's ask this question. Let's think through this a little bit. What is the temple? What is the temple? It's a place to worship God. So it is, especially in Jerusalem and in Israel, it is the place to worship God, right? It is the place. It's the only place where sacrifice is allowed to be offered. It is where God dwells in the Ark of the Covenant, right? It is not only a place to worship God, it is the place to worship God. And was the temple important to the Jewish people?
Yes.
Very much so, right? Obviously, because it was the place to worship God. And without the temple there, you couldn't worship God. You couldn't offer the sacrifices that were required. You couldn't do these things that God required as his worship. Now, when Jesus says that one is greater than the temple, Of course, he's referring to himself. So what is it about Jesus that makes him as a person greater than the temple?
He's the object of the worship. The reason the temple was built was to worship him.
Very good, exactly. The temple points people to God. Jesus was dwelling among the people as God in flesh. He is the object of worship, just as she said. And that you go to the temple in order to worship God, and Jesus is saying, listen, I'm greater than the temple because I am God. You go to the temple to get to me. You go to the temple to worship me, but I'm standing here right in your presence right now. He is greater than the temple.
But now we are the temple.
Now we are the temple.
Know ye not ye are the temple? You are the temple of the Holy Ghost.
That's right. As the Holy Ghost abides in believers, we become the temple. We become that dwelling place, that tabernacle, that tent, as it were, housing the very presence and the Spirit of God, as it was the pillar and the cloud in the desert. Brother Charlie?
That's why we are more obligated to serve God all the time and worship God all the time. Because the temple is in us.
Absolutely.
We
We are.
are the place that we should worship God in the morning, in the night time, and all the time in between.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as we talked about Sunday morning, even a little bit, we don't have to go to a temple to worship. All these religions, they go to a temple because their God lives in the temple. We can worship anywhere we go. Everywhere we go is holy ground. Everywhere we bend our knee is holy ground because the presence and the Spirit of the Lord is there. We are a tabernacle, as it were, a mobile temple carrying the presence of God with us everywhere we go.
The problem was that only a few of the believers believed who he was. So the others thought he was supposed to be being blasphemed.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Yeah, and at this point, we're still very early in Jesus' ministry. He has revealed himself. He revealed himself who he was in Nazareth. And what was the result of that? They wanted to kill him. They tried to push him off a cliff. And he left from there, and he's been doing his ministry. And what we've been studying over the last number of weeks is his continual conflict with the religious leaders. And we're getting really to the peak of this. This is really the apex of his conflict because, when Jesus is here challenging their traditions concerning the Sabbath, he's like challenging the Holy Grail. He's like rearranging the sanctuary, okay? He's like changing the carpet at church right now. Jesus is really messing with people's tradition over here. And they don't like it. And they don't like it at all. In fact, we're going to see just how little they like it as we continue to progress here. But that's exactly right. He says, one greater than the temple is. Now, do you think they understood that when he said that?
No.
Because what is he claiming right now? When he says that, what is he claiming?
To be God.
To be God. And they're thinking, what? Imagine if someone walked in here and claimed to be God, right? I mean, what are we going to think? Now imagine if that same person was healing the sick and casting out devils and doing all this crazy stuff that we've never seen before. Maybe that adds a little credibility. But if we saw someone in here who was claiming to be God, I don't think most of us would understand what he was talking about, even if it was somebody as remarkable as Jesus. But he says he is greater than the temple. He doesn't elaborate. He just continues. Look at what he says in verse 7. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. You would not have condemned the guiltless. So what is he saying there? They're a bunch of hypocrites, exactly. And so what is it? What is he saying? He's saying, well, again, we talked about this on Sunday, so if you weren't here, you missed this. But remember what the prophet said to Saul. When Saul disobeyed God and he left the animals alive when God said to kill them all. And what was his excuse? He said, yeah, we left them alive because we wanted to offer them to you as a sacrifice. And then what did the prophet say? He said, it is better to obey than sacrifice. I would rather you just do what I'm telling you to do than offer me sacrifice. And here he's not quoting from that passage. He's quoting from a passage in Micah. He's quoting from a passage in the Minor Prophets. But he's saying something very similar. I would rather you be merciful than to offer this great sacrifice. I would rather you have mercy on these hungry, starving men than I would have you to doggedly hold to your traditions. It's as though Jesus is saying, you don't understand the point of God's law. You don't understand. Because God requires mercy. He doesn't require this kind of sacrifice. If it comes between just holding to your religious traditions doggedly to the detriment of somebody else when you could show mercy, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're worshiping God wrong. You're obeying God wrong. Imagine if you were driving to church and it's church time and you're running a little bit late and you see you're standing outside the donut store because you forgot that we have donuts and coffee in the morning. So you're at the donut store and you're waiting to go to church, and there's this guy standing outside who is just obviously in bad straits. And you walk out and this guy starts a conversation with you, and it's obvious that this person needs some help from the Lord. And you say, listen, don't you understand? I got to go to church. I'm late for church. I'm missing church right now. You're interrupting me. It's very important. I need to obey God. I need to go to church. So you just leave that guy in the dust and you go to church. Do you think God is pleased with something like that? Not so much, right? Why? Because in that particular instance, our going to church is like the sacrifice. And our taking the time to minister to this person who we're running into, according to God's providence, that would be like the mercy. I'm reminded of a time where I was in a church service. This is another example of this. And there was a fellow that I worked with, and he was having a hard time in one of his relationships. And he had called me, and he wanted to talk to me. And it was during church time. And so he gets here, and he messages me. He says, I'm here. So I get up, and I go outside to talk to this guy. And not very long after that, someone, later after the service, I'm being scolded by somebody for getting up and walking out of the church service to go and talk to this guy. And they're saying, it's important for you to be here in church. It's important for you to be here worshiping God. If he wanted something, he could have come in and got the touch from God that he was looking for, And even then, I realized, this guy is wrong. This whole thing is backwards. That's not right. Why? Because God desires mercy, not sacrifice. It is an act of worship to be merciful. And I think it's one that God values more than when we hold to our religious traditions. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. And look at what he says. If you know what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. You would not have condemned the guiltless. What is he saying?
They're trying to pass judgment.
They're trying to pass judgment. They are literally condemning the disciples.
This is where they're welcoming people. Well, they were guiltless. What they were doing was not a sin.
Right.
They were trying to treat it as a sin.
As a sin. And we already know, what is the punishment for Sabbath violation?
Yeah.
Death. They're trying to condemn to death these disciples who were guiltless. They didn't even violate God's law. They didn't even do anything.
But he also knows that they're
Mm-hmm. He is guiltless. And do we think that Jesus, this is like our fourth point of conflict, does Jesus kind of get the idea at this point, you think, about his relationship with these religious leaders? Do you think he knows their attitude towards him? We will find out very soon if that's the case as we continue to progress. But yes, he says, if you would have understand, you teachers, you scribes, you Pharisees, if you really understood the Bible that you claim to understand, you would know that what you're doing right now is wicked and that you are condemning the innocent. You wouldn't do that if you really understood what God was saying in his law.
I find this fascinating. There's a mirror image. Yesterday is an important day too, because that's the day that Martin Luther started the Protestant religion, which comes from the word protest. When 195 theses on the birth of evil. anyhow, it's just like what Jesus is doing here, he's saying, my word is more important than man's word.
Mm-hmm.
And because of man's word, he looked at the Bible to say what you want. And that's what Luther did too. He said that sola fide, and by faith alone, by grace alone, by the word alone.
Mm-hmm.
That's, because they got away, the Catholic religion became run by men, not by God.
There is a very interesting parallel when we compare these, because in the Roman Catholic religion, there's actually been a very similar development to what had happened in Jesus' day with with the Jewish religion, which is over the course of centuries, traditions developed, and those traditions were put on an equal footing of equal authority, and in reality, a greater authority than the Word of God. So there's actually a very similar event happening there, where over time the religious traditions of men become more authoritative than God's Word. And so that everything is viewed not through the lens of God's Word, but through the lens of the traditions of men. And when you're in violation of the traditions of men, those religious leaders don't like that, right? Very good. That's a good mirror image, as you said. Very true.
There is an importance of Halloween. It's not really Halloween. It has to do with the birth of getting back to what God says.
Yeah, Reformation Day. Reformation Day is a holiday that should be celebrated. Halloween's a fake holiday. We should celebrate Reformation Day. I agree. I know you didn't say that, but I'm saying that.
No, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at Matthew 23 for just a moment. I want to continue this. He said, you guys don't understand. They were so obsessed with their own self-righteousness and upholding the letter of their own traditions that they leave off the real purpose of God's law. And Jesus, in Matthew 23, and we're just going to read one verse here, but he really lets them have it for this, because this is a real problem. Chapter 23, verse 23. And in this section, this is where Jesus is pronouncing his woes upon the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And this is just blistering judgment speech by Jesus to these religious leaders toward the end of his ministry. But look at what he says in Matthew 23, verse 23. Anyone can read that when you get there.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay
Tithe. Yep.
of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matter of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving others undone.
And this is exactly what he's saying, right? Woe unto you, you hypocrites, because you tithe to the very gram of your mint and your dill and you tithe to the very tiny fragment. All the while you neglect the more important aspects of the law, mercy and faith and justice. He said you should keep the law. You should uphold what God has said. You should do the former, but you should not leave the latter undone. It is more important to uphold the weightier matters of the law. He calls them hypocrites because they neglect and reject the Word of God in favor for their own legalistic tradition. And for that, they're called hypocrites. And woes are pronounced upon them. And in their own self-righteousness, they condemn innocent people who never violated his law. And so the last part of Jesus' response now, let's look at verse 8. Yeah, I'm sorry, Matthew chapter 12, verse 8. I forgot to go back there. Matthew chapter 12, let's look at the last part of Jesus' response, verse 8.
For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, what does that mean? What is he saying? Who is the Son of Man?
Him.
Him. Right? And where does that phrase, where does that saying, Son of Man, where does that come from? It comes from the Old Testament prophets. Particularly the book of Daniel. The Son of Man. The Son of Man is a messianic reference. Jesus, he says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. What does that mean? He is the master of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. He gets to decide what goes and what doesn't go. He gets to decide what's lawful and what's unlawful. The Son of Man gets to say, this is okay and this is not okay. See, they didn't understand who he was. They didn't understand that he's the one who decreed the Sabbath in the first place. He's the one who spoke to Moses. He's the one who revealed the Sabbath. He is the one who decreed the very law they were accusing him of breaking. Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Just as he had the authority to forgive sins, just as he has the authority to cleanse those who are unclean, Jesus, the Son of Man, has the authority to say what goes and what doesn't go, because he's the one who established it in the first place. I think he knows what God intended in the Sabbath commands, because he's the one who gave them, right? Any other thoughts about that or questions so far? Very good. I expect everyone to pass the quiz at the end of class here. I'm playing. Here we go. Let's move forward, though. Because in that story, we saw the kind of false hope of self-righteousness, right? We see the false hope of legalism, how the Pharisees, they considered themselves to be righteous because they kept all these traditions. And Jesus just took their traditions and threw them in the trash can. And then when they got mad about it, he made fun of them, basically, and said, you guys are ignorant. You don't know anything. He just took their traditions and stepped all over them. He doesn't care about what they have to say. They thought they were righteous because of this, and Jesus is pointing out, no, you're not righteous at all. You're condemning the innocent. You're ignorant. You don't even know what God meant when he said these things. And now you're condemning the innocent. But not only so, this continues. This is only the first example. And immediately following this is another story of Jesus on the Sabbath, doing another thing on the Sabbath. And we're going to see just what a conflict it stirs up here. Now remember what I said a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the rules and the regulations concerning the Sabbath. They had rules about medicine, practicing medicine on the Sabbath. And one of the rules was you are not allowed to administer like medicine as a doctor might do. Of course, when I say that, don't think like the modern context, because that did not exist. But you weren't allowed to do like any kind of healing ministry in terms of like giving people medicine or trying to treat their sicknesses. None of that was allowed. The only time it was allowed is if someone's life was in danger. And there was a couple specific examples we talked about. If somebody sprained their arm on the Sabbath, they could not seek any medical attention. They couldn't even pour cold water on it until the next day because it was not life-threatening. If a building collapsed on somebody, you were allowed to remove the rubble. And if you found them alive, you could dig them out. But if you found them dead, you just had to leave them there until the next day. Okay? This was part of the tradition surrounding healing on the Sabbath. So don't forget about that as we move in now to verses 9 through 14 in Matthew chapter 12. Let's just go ahead and read verses 9 through 14. This is the whole story.
Now when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, how they might destroy him.
Okay, very good. Let's go ahead and read the other accounts of this too. Excuse me, in Mark chapter 3. I guess we weren't in Mark chapter 3 yet. We were at the end of chapter 2. So let's read Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6.
Synagogue,
Mm-hmm.
and a man with their belly with his hand. So they watched him closely, knew that each would kill him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. He said to the man who led him with his hand, step forward. And he said to him, it is lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill. But they kept silent.
And verse 5 and 6 as well.
And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their heart, he said to his hand, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored, and whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the
Herodians is that word.
Herodians against the dilated plotted with the Lord against him, how they might destroy him.
Okay, and then let's finally read Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. Luke 6, verses 6 through 11.
Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save the life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus.
Okay, so that is the story. That is the rest of this Sabbath story. And let's go ahead and work our way through it. Now, Jesus enters into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and there, what does he find? A man with a withered hand. Now, it's kind of interesting. The word withered here is actually a very good word to use because it's also used of like a wilted flower. It's the kind of word that describes like the little pecan sapling that's grown up in my front yard that got ate up by silkworms. When a plant begins to die and it begins to wilt and it becomes withered. Now we've all seen someone who's got a withered hand. Like we've seen that, the kind of person who's got the withered hand. That's the idea. It's like a dead limb. It's like a withered plant. It's not functional. It doesn't work. You can't really do anything with it. And that's the idea that's being communicated here. So Jesus walks in the synagogue. He sees a man with a withered hand. But he's not the only one there. Who else is in the synagogue that day? The Pharisees. And what is it that they are doing? Are they there to worship God? Are they there to study Torah? Are they there to devote their lives to God? What is it that the Pharisees and the scribes are doing?
They're find fault with Jesus.
They're plotting. They're trying to plot on Jesus. They're trying to find fault. They're trying to find a reason to accuse him because they're highly upset. Conflict after conflict. Remember, they already had conflict over his authority. He said he had the power to forgive sins. They had conflict over the fact that he associated with sinners. They had conflict over the fact that he did not practice their same religious practices of fasting and etc. They are having these problems now of his adherence to the oral tradition, his violating of the Sabbath traditions. And so they're mad. And they're looking for a reason to accuse him. They're looking for a reason that he can get in trouble. That's why they're there. They're looking for that. But what does it say about Jesus?
He doesn't care
He doesn't care.
how angry they are,
Uh-huh.
and he does care about the hurting person with the shriveled hand.
That's right.
And he fully intends to heal him, and he, yet again, doesn't care what they think.
Exactly.
Or what they intend to do, and he knows what they intend to do.
He knows what they intend to do, and he doesn't care about what they intend to do, right? And that's exactly what it says. Jesus knows their thoughts. He knows their thoughts. And you remember in the account of Matthew, it actually talks about how the scribes and Pharisees came to him and asked the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now we already know, we've heard the tradition, we've examined what the religious tradition at the time said. And in a situation like this, the answer would have been no. According to the tradition, no, it's not lawful to heal on the Sabbath. Not a man with a withered hand. Is his life in danger? No, he's not going to die because he has a withered hand. He had a withered hand yesterday. He'll have a withered hand tomorrow. Jesus, if you want to heal him, wait till sundown. Right? But Jesus knows their thoughts. And what is his response?
And Mark, it says he looked around at them with anger,
Mm-hmm.
being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. And he had already had the man to step up, and because he knew what they were thinking. And it's not so much that he had to prove himself, but I think he was making the point that I can do this, and I can do this, because basically I have mercy for him. Not that, well, I can do this and then boo-boo, I'm gonna do it anyway. I think he's trying to make a point with them, and he's done that several times, of telling them, you've got to be merciful.
Thank God reveals a nice little secret that if you have a problem with the laws and all that stuff, you can answer it, well, and it's to do good, it's to show mercy, then God's fine with it. So if you ever have to double check, I don't know if the law says this, but is it good? Are you helping somebody? Is it merciful? There you go. There's your answer. And every time the Pharisees, the Sadducees, Herodians, anytime they came, it wasn't to listen to find out what he had to say. They had already decided what that man was. They come to build evidence to condemn him. There's not one time that he ever met these guys. They always knew their heart was already decided.
Yeah.
Well, and it's deeper than that. If he is God, they're not necessary. Neither is the temple. Neither is any of that stuff. If he really is God in the flesh, right here, right now, then everything else is obsolete. It doesn't matter anymore. Therefore, they have no job, they have no power, they have no authority, they have no money, they have no nothing. They have no worship from the lay people, they have nothing. And somewhere in the bottom of their mind, they know all that, and they're thinking all that, and they're angry about all that. They don't want him to be God.
They're threatened by him also.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And he is love. And he, by all means, will heal.
She's
That
right about
man.
a lot of that too, because they knew the scriptures, and they knew the prophecies. They knew that he was God, but he wasn't the God that they wanted. And that's why their hearts were so hard. Because you're right, they wanted,
He didn't fit their mold.
right, they wanted the attention, they wanted the reverence over him, But then God beat it all because he changed everything after his death, burial, and resurrection. Because now he is the Sabbath. His yoke is easy.
Jesus is also saying that people are more important than tradition. And a lot of times us as a church forget that.
That's true. You know, you say that, it reminds me of this idea and I actually heard some people talking about this week, is, oftentimes we read things, and as we read stories or books or whatever, we read ourselves into the story, sometimes as the victim. We identify ourselves as the one who's being wronged. Sometimes we read ourselves into the story as the hero, the ones who come to save the day. But probably a more accurate way to read ourselves into stories oftentimes is to read ourselves in as the villains. Read ourselves in as the ones who are just going along to get along. And in a story like this, as our brother said, it's easy for us to read into the story, those stupid Pharisees, they honored their traditions over the Son of Man, and they were politically afraid, and they didn't want to lose their livelihood. But, isn't it true that usually, if we're going to read ourselves into the story, I'm probably going to read myself in as one who would be afraid of my livelihood being threatened by someone being like this. So often, wouldn't it be more honest if we read ourselves into the story as the ones who honored our traditions over and above what the Word has to say in certain areas? Now, of course, we strive not to be that way. We don't want to be that way. But it is so easy to fall into that trap. I mean, it is a trap. And it's very easy to fall into that. And you know what they say, as soon as you think that you can't fall, that's when it's going to happen. Take heed yourself lest you fall. I read in a book somewhere one time. So, very good. Any other thoughts? Any other ideas? It's very good. Well, it says he knows their thoughts. Look at what else it says. And he said to the man, rise up and stand in the midst. And as our sister pointed out, in Mark it says he looked around at the hardness of their hearts, and he was filled with anger. Now, this is the first place in the Gospels where it talks about, and in fact, it may be the only place, where it talks about Jesus being filled with anger. We saw that textual variant a couple months ago, but I don't think that's an accurate reading. But there's no doubt about it right here that it says Jesus was filled with anger. There's no variant here. Jesus was filled with anger at the hardness of their heart. How was that hardness manifested? Yeah, how was the hardness of the religious leaders, the hardness of their hearts? What did that look like?
They weren't concerned at all about the man with the shriveled hand.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't matter, not at all to them. They were just watching to see if he would heal. He knew that man from the moment he got here till the day he dies, and he knew the pain and suffering he had from walking around with a hand like that and all that would bring about in a man's life. And he had mercy. And he, everywhere he goes, he heals. It's like things couldn't be in his presence that didn't get healed if he's there.
And they would rather that man suffer than Jesus to heal him. More than that, they would rather that Jesus healed him in order that they could condemn him of violating their laws and have him put away. Now, if that's not a hard heart, if that's not a hypocritical heart, I don't know what is. I don't know which is worse, sister.
Well, they were, he gave the example of, if the sheep fall into a pit,
Mm-hmm.
well, how much more value is a man than sheep? He tried to, I guess, open their eyes to that, but they were so hardened that they could not even absorb any of that.
Yeah. And that's very good. Let's talk about that for a moment, because he shares this example. He says, listen, is it lawful on the Sabbath day to do good or to do evil? To save a life or to destroy it? And in Matthew, he gave the example of the sheep that fell into the pit. And he says, look, if you had a sheep that fell into the pit, would you get it out or would you just leave it there? And of course they would get it out. I can't help but think that maybe over the last couple of weeks there might have been a big fuss in town because some of the sheep that belonged to the Pharisees had fell into a pit. And they had to gather everybody together to get them out. Now, I don't know if that happened or not, but preachers oftentimes use examples from life, right? So maybe something like this had happened recently where a sheep fell into a pit. Huh?
It happened to Charlie one Sunday. He missed church because You had a cow in a mud bog, you had to dig it out.
And if you would have mercy on a cow in a mud bog on the Sabbath day when you're supposed to be at church, how much more important is a man than that stupid cow? Right? And you say, well, that cow is very valuable. How much more valuable is a man than a cow? Especially a man that now has two hands who can work for himself.
They had no love for their neighbor.
They had no love. They had no mercy. They had hardened hearts. They cared more about their possessions, their animals, than they did about this man with a withered hand.
And they were so bound by these rules that they made up. That they couldn't.
The rule kept them from loving their neighbor.
Exactly.
That's one of the things that Jesus was so upset about in these rules. They're not a God man.
And they became slaves to their traditions. And then what's worse, it's one thing to become a slave to your tradition, but it's another thing entirely when in your slavery to your traditions and in your violation of God's commands, you then consider yourself more righteous than other people. And that was like the double judgment that they had. Not only did they become enslaved to their traditions, but they felt like they were more holy than everybody else in that state, right? And that anyone else who wasn't enslaved to their traditions was less than them. And they became the ultimate religious hypocrites as a result. Look at what he says about when he says in verse 9 of Luke 6, I ask you, he says, is it lawful to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? Think about this for a moment. Jesus, as he is saying these words, he has it in his mind to do good, to heal this man. They have it in their minds to do evil. Why were they even there?
You're trying to accuse Jesus of doing something unlawful.
So they can kill him.
So they could kill him.
They want to kill him.
They had it in their heart to do evil against Jesus on the Sabbath day. And Jesus is saying, hey, it's the Sabbath day. What's good? You tell me. Is it better to do good to heal this man? Am I doing what's good? Or is it better to do evil while you're here plotting and trying to kill me? Which one of us do you think is actually doing better in this situation? Me, the one who's trying to do good? Or you, the one who's plotting on how you might have me killed? Is it better to do good or is it better to do evil? It's better to do good. And of course in Mark it says that they held their peace. They didn't have anything to say about that, did they? They didn't have anything to say about that.
I think it's funny that in several of these examples, I think all three of them, not only is he healing, he tells him get up in front of everybody to do it. It's like, I'm not going to meet you in the hallway or call you outside. Stand up. Everybody should see this one.
Yep. Stand up, come into the midst, he says. Come into the middle. And here he comes. Imagine being this guy. He's like in the middle of this drama. He's like, I just want my hand healed. Like, I'm cool with it,
But how in your face?
Yeah.
Isn't that great?
Yeah. Like I say, he takes their traditions and he just stomps on them. He doesn't care. He's and think about what he's doing. In that, he is revealing the utter hypocrisy and wickedness that rests in their hearts. These are the holy people. These are the ones that everyone in the community looks up to. And Jesus, in his godly troublemaking, is revealing just how wicked and hypocritical these men are. Because as he's doing good, they hate him and they want to kill him for it. They're insulted. And they're threatened, as was pointed out earlier.
They never argued back with him.
No, they didn't have a lot to say.
No, they never do. Every time he has an encounter with them, he knows he has the authority. That's why I know they know who he really is.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Even when he calls him a brute or vipers, you don't see that same things back to him. Not until he's actually taken in before he's, before the council, before he gets nailed to the cross. That's the only time that they ever really use actually the prophesy that.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And, what we've been studying over the last number of weeks is really this. We're still very early in Jesus' ministry. He hasn't. From here, we're going to move on, and he's going to choose the 12, and we're going to get into the Sermon on the Mount. Hopefully, in the beginning of January, is my plan, is my goal, Lord willing. Excuse me. The first Wednesday of January, we'll get into the Sermon on the Mount. But at this point in his ministry, It's just been a series of conflict with the religious leaders because they're threatened, because he's violating their traditions, because he's claiming this certain kind of authority, and they just don't really like it. And at this point, it has gotten to such a boiling point that Jesus is calling them out in front of the entire synagogue. He's just right in their face about what he's doing, what he's claiming, just totally casting their, just undermining their authority in the community totally, right? Because he's exposing them as hypocrites, which is what they are. So he heals the man. And what is the response of the religious leaders? How do the religious leaders respond to Jesus treating them this way? They were furious.
I could just see them in the.
Instead of being amazed that he could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about what they were going to do and how they could do it.
Yes. And that's exactly the idea that's communicated. I mean, in Luke it says they were filled with madness and they communed with one another to what they might do with Jesus. What do the other gospels say?
Matthew says plotted, they might kill him, went out and plotted,
So they wanted to kill him.
how they might kill him.
That's what Jesus said. Is it better to save life or destroy it? Is it better for me to save this man? Is it better for me to do good? Am I the one who's wrong, or are you the one who's wrong? Because you're condemning the innocent and plotting to kill me for doing what is good. And they did. And when he did it, they sure did. They wanted to kill him. And they were there to find a reason to accuse him. He gave them every reason in the book right there to do it. He did exactly what they wanted him to do. But he did it in such a way that they couldn't object to it. Because while he was doing it, he exposed them for their hypocrisy. He exposed them that they were wrong, that they didn't understand, that they were hypocrites, and that he was doing good.
One thing that really, if you overlook it, he just did a miracle. So they know that how to be a miracle God, where they can try to say it was a thing. He just did a miracle. How can you argue with that?
Yeah.
So he has to get, he did the miracle, he has to be authority.
In one place it says he healed the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, kingdom divided against itself will not stand.
Yeah, that's when Jesus quoted Abraham Lincoln.
Or vice
Yeah, no, that happened, and we're actually going to get to that next week. We're going to look at that. That is like the conclusion of this conflict. Is it gets to a point where not only was there conflict over his authority, not only was there conflict over his association, his activity, not only was there conflict over his adherence to the religious traditions, but finally it comes to a point where the Pharisees outright accuse him of being satanic, of being possessed by the devil. And we're going to read that. We're going to go through that next week. But I want us to look before we close. Let's go back to Mark chapter 3 for a moment, because this is important, and this is going to come. This is going to play a pretty major part in the story, or it might not play a major part, but it really gives us an important idea of something that's going on here, and I want to focus on it for a moment. Look at Mark chapter 3, verse 6. Mark chapter 3, verse 6 says this, "And the Pharisees went forth, and straightway, immediately, they took counsel with the Herodians against him, and how they might destroy him." Now, who are the Herodians? Who are those people?
Parents.
They were the
guards.
Yeah, the followers of Herod, right? We're Christians. We're the followers of Christ. These were the Herodians. These are the followers of Herod. These are and who is Herod? Herod was the king of Judea, right? And of course, Herod the Great was the king when the time Jesus was born. He's the one who killed all the babies in Bethlehem. Herod at this point had died and distributed the kingdom amongst his 4 sons. So now there's different Herods in different parts, right? But the part where Jesus lived, there was a certain Herod there, the one who ended up condemning Jesus eventually. And Herod had political authority in Judea. Now the Pharisees began to take counsel with the Herodians in order to destroy and kill Jesus. Why? understand, the Pharisees did not like Herod. The Pharisees did not like the Herodians. The Pharisees looked at the Herodians as Hellenized, basically Greek, not even Jews. They didn't like Herod. But because of their intense hatred for Jesus, they're starting to link up with these people they don't even like, who have political authority. That's the key here. The Herodians had political authority
Things that they couldn't.
to do things that they could not do. They could pull strings because they could pull strings that the Pharisees couldn't pull because they had connections with Rome. And if someone was going to die in a Roman province, it was only because Rome said so. If someone was going to get executed in a Roman province, it was only at the command of Caesar or his people under him. So from this point, they were plotting to kill Jesus, and they were making the political connections to make it happen. So intense was their hatred for Jesus that they made strange bedfellows with the Herodians, a people who normally they would never associate with. And that's going to come back as we progress through the story and we find out what happens to Jesus as time goes on. But with that, does anybody else have any closing thoughts, closing ideas, anything you'd like to add or any questions? Thank you. Yeah, talk about breaking the ice, right? Well, I just want to say by way of application very briefly, that what can we take away from these stories, particularly these Sabbath stories we've read? The major takeaway is that to do good is greater than to observe religious ceremony. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. It is a form of worship. Remember what Jesus said the golden rule is. Do unto others as you would have done to yourself. If you were the one, do you think these Pharisees, if they were the ones with withered hands, they would have been worried about whether or not Jesus was healing on a Sabbath? They hated their brethren. They hated their neighbor. They would rather him suffer than to see Jesus heal him. To do good is better than to observe religious ceremony, religious tradition.
I'm going with a form of love. Mercy, hope, faith, all another acronym for love. See, that's what's going on in Jerusalem over there now. They hate each other so much.
Yeah, there's
I
no...
was thinking about that too, that they hated him, wanted to murder him, hated him so much. That's kind of that hate is alive and well today.
It's more than that, though. Their religion in the Quran 7, 8 surah, they command them to do this. And the only way they can be assured that they're going to heaven is to die as a martyr. And their God wants no relationship with them. He just wants us to give 72 virgins. You can choose boys or girls, whatever you want. There's such things as homosexuality up there, you can do whatever you want. But the thing is, that's the only way they're sure of going to heaven, is to die as a martyr. Not even Muhammad was sure if he went to heaven. So that's why you see these things. They're so weak. They don't realize that the religion they're following is after Satan. Even their end times prophecy was exactly what our Bible says the opposite. They're the ones going to be killing Christians and thinking they're doing good.
It is so. I also just want to emphasize before we come to a close here that the conflict that Jesus was having, all of these conflicts, it was not over the goodness of God's law. The conflict was not a conflict of they wanted to uphold the law and Jesus said the law is no more. That was not the conflict. The conflict was that the religious leaders were upholding their own human traditions over and above the commands of God. They considered their own traditions more important than the law of God, and Jesus was showing them that in that they were actually being disobedient to God's law. So the conflict was not one of the law is bad and they were just too legalistic. It wasn't the law that was the problem, it was their traditions. It was the fact that they were religious hypocrites who claimed to be the servants of God, but who disobeyed God in order to uphold their own religious tradition. Okay, I keep emphasizing that. I'm going to keep on emphasizing it.
They didn't want to lose their power.
Yep.
It's just like when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, well, they really wanted to care, because if you read that, it says that they wanted to kill him because they were afraid he was, their people would start following him.
Yep.
And they didn't believe him.
Yep.
And they didn't want that to happen, they would lose their power.
That's right.
It's all about
That's exactly right.
power.
That's exactly right. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. This was really good. I really enjoyed this. Brother Chuck, can you close us in prayer?